We've seen it, we tend to group these types of people who need to get behind API success as falling into three groups of you call it your traditional business sponsorship, the kind of part of the community, the IT teams, and the grouping of, I kind of call them transformation or digital teams. They have kind of and these are not organizational structures. This is looking at the functional capabilities. But that first group is leading with the big strategic vision, is explaining how creating an environment in which one can open up to new markets, open up to new different ways of collaborating with partners that haven't happened in the past, getting behind and championing the support and empowering teams to then come up with API products and come up with capability and the cultural change. So that's your business side that needs to be involved and leading. You've got your IT side, ensuring that the right API management tooling and platforms and engineering capability and robustness of execution is right, and that new ideas can come forward perhaps from existing internal development communities. But then the third is this, and it's more than an interpreter. It's not just an interpreter of business requirements, to be and to act as a kind of a bridge between business and IT. These three groups all are kind of peers in this API space. But this third group is there to really deeply understand how the strategy and opportunities can be brought to life.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the API Resilience Podcast. We hope that you've been getting a lot from these discussions. We certainly have been getting a lot from these discussions, and we've been trying to reach out to various people in the API community, from people who are running API programs in their organizations to people like we have today, who is an expert in the API field. And I'm very happy to introduce Claire Barrett. She's a director of APIsFirst Consulting, where she helps organizations realize the potential of APIs. She comes to this work with more than 30 years' experience at large financial institutions and consulting firms in Australia, the UK, and Hong Kong. And she specializes in translating strategy into plans that can be executed and executing plans that both reflect and influence strategy. She also does a lot of research into what makes IT-enabled change and transformation stick. She's also a leader of the global Women in APIs community. So if you haven't met Claire and you want to learn more about her, you can connect with her on LinkedIn and check out the blog posts that she writes for APIsFirst.com. And you can learn more about APIs First at that same address. And there is also a link there for the initiative to foster women in the APIs community, and you can become a member there. And we're certainly really excited about supporting women in this tech field, and it's a great opportunity for women to connect with other women in this field. I'm your host, Mark Winberry. I'm the Senior Director of Operations in the U.S. for Pronovix, and Christophe Van Humme is my co-host, CEO of Pronovix. So we've had a great conversation getting started. She's talking to us today from the UK. And Claire, thank you for being here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, and Christophe. It's a delight to be here and joining you from England.
I'm really looking forward to this one. I always look forward to them, to be honest. Else we wouldn't invite you, right?
Do you like to talk about APIs, Christophe?
I don't know what you're talking. No, we've had previous conversations, so and we immediately hit it off, and we started talking about some really, really interesting subjects. Like we've been talking about the interface program or interface opportunity or whatever we're going to call it. And it just struck me that it would be really cool to have you here on the podcast to talk about some of your experience and to try to push forward our shared knowledge through conversations. So
As you say, we always have great conversations, and I'm looking forward to sharing and bouncing some more and learning more, because I always learn something from our talks. So thank you very much again for having me.
So thank you for joining. And you've been doing the past year, you've been doing some research that I thought was quite interesting, because one of the key insights that we've talked about before is that technology on its own doesn't solve problems. Technology is just a tool. And, like if you don't have someone with an intention using the tool to do the right job, you don't get very far. So, and your research has been about how IT changes help organizations to change, and how to make those changes stick, and how to actually really transform organizations. Can you maybe tell a little bit more about that research that you've done?
Yeah, sure. So I've been talking to tech-savvy business leaders, to CTOs, CIOs, seasoned technologists, consultants who have worked and experienced and seen many types of IT-enabled change and transformation over decades. And these are people who've seen what's successful in terms of making change, and also what they've learned and observed through the process. And the hypothesis that I presented to them was that organizations, particularly more mature organizations that are investing a lot in IT-enabled change over many years, that those types of businesses are often seeing business cases return, being recycled, if you like, after, it can be 18 months or a couple of years, for requesting investment for things that actually under the covers look like they're trying to address problems that are quite similar to previous cases that haven't, that have fallen short of what was expected. And actually, as organizations are undertaking broader and more far-reaching change under often the digital transformation agenda or equivalent, the scope of these changes is getting broader. So what are some of the things that people are doing that are successful in making change stick, so that they don't act, so they're actually building out and increasing the foundations, that they're making change that we can build on from, as opposed to going back and trying to affect things. So the other hypothesis that I went in with was that there are a number of things that these transformation agendas are seeking to achieve that are common. And this is across many industries, by the way. So this is, some of them included financial services, but included travel, insurance, infrastructure, manufacturing, distribution. And there were some things that they in common all want to achieve. They want to be able to get faster at driving IT-enabled change. They want to be able to speed up the way, things that they want to do to make a difference for their business. So they want their business strategies to be able to come to life faster, to be able to offer new, better experiences, better, different products. They want to get good at collaborating better. They want to be able to innovate faster. They want to adopt good engineering disciplines and agile practices at scale. They want to be able to use the kinds of cultures and behaviors that allow them to absorb change and deliver it quickly. In order to do that, there are right ways of doing things. And I've been talking to them about not the right versus the wrong or black and white, but asking them of a couple of different sensible strategies on a number of dimensions. Where would they choose to put their effort and investment? So if they had a choice about how to move forward, both of which are good choices, a trade-off that they would like, which would they anchor on? So I'll give you an example. One of the things I asked them was, in order to make impact of their change understood and for it to resonate with stakeholders, would they look to put, so they have a trade-off between putting their effort and investment in communication management, in connecting with, on things that were very close to the customer and the employee, so things that were sort of going to make a really material difference to people at the coalface of change, or do they put their effort into managing external stakeholders to the organization? So they're going to put their effort into things that will resonate with shareholders or executive. So if you put all your effort into just supporting things that will make a difference with your change to your actual customers, you risk getting too small. You risk you risk only being heard by at the customer level, and you lose potentially the risk of getting ongoing funding and consistent business case because you haven't been supporting enough of your external stakeholders. If you spend all your effort with them, you will potentially have the risk of just being too internally focused and you're not actually making a difference to customers. That's an example of where do you want to put your effort into getting attention with your success in order to take your project, your program, your initiative, your change through and get momentum. And in that example, we heard that the people would put 70% of their effort towards the customer employee impact piece because the results that are felt by, and it could be suppliers or it's the people who are actually getting impact out of the technology, 70% of the effort there will be heard by those more broadly in the organization. But one shouldn't forget that regulators, external, it could be shareholders, could be, also need to be able to see the results of the change you're getting behind. And so you want to be spending some of your effort there. So this is just an example of one of the trade-offs that we talked about in order to be able to manage that communication side of your program. Why is that relevant for APIs? Because I've been hearing consistently again and again and again for people's success with an API-enabled change or an API program, that communication is the one thing that they often either underestimated or that they needed to consistently do more and more of. And I think a number of the people that you've had on your podcast series have called that out as a key learning. So one thing is you need to do lots of communication, you need to invest in it, get the people in your team that can do that. But then the question is, where do you get them to focus their efforts?
Very interesting. And why do you split it between customers and employees are in the same bucket versus the regulators and shareholders, stakeholders in the other bucket?
Because that first bucket is the people who are actually going to be using the tech that you are changing.
Okay.
The second bucket is the people who need for the overall investment to realize benefit. So this is how it informs your business case, right? So if you spend all of your time and effort on ensuring that everybody understands what the business case is and that that the benefits are being demonstrated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you are now there are certain types of initiatives where so some people will make IT-enabled investments that is purely about addressing a regulatory type of change. So clearly that the balance in that case might be different. So this is not kind of take this stuff verbatim, but it allows you to think about an example of trade-offs that people are making at any point in time.
I think
has that answered your question?
Yeah, it does. It's very interesting because I hadn't thought all that much about like the position of the regulator as a stakeholder in an API program, or even the which is like massive blind spot. And I think there's very few people talking about that in the API scene, or almost none. Maybe I think that there's like in the PSD2 initiative for sure. There it comes up, but it's a really interesting take. It's like
almost that there's a direct group that's involved, and then there's an indirect group of stakeholders.
Yeah,
and the indirect group is one that can easily be neglected. And you're saying that for a change program, including around APIs, you've really got to take into account those kind of external regulators that people don't necessarily think about.
Yeah. And my question of people was, where I describe this scale as where do the messages need to resonate?
This resonates, or this message is very similar to something I've heard in the inner sourcing community. Inner sourcing is it's like open source, but inside of a large enterprise. Mm-hmm. So there's like a whole community around it. It's really cool people. Very, very nice open community. So go check them out if it's up your alley. And they talk about ground cover and air cover. So you need both. So, and if you don't have ground cover, if you don't cater to the people on, executing stuff, then it's not going to work. If you don't cater to the executives and the air cover, it's also not going to work. So it's very, very similar.
So I actually think those are much better labels for my two scales. So thank you. I will probably use those going forward. But it's actually the ground cover one is the people who are impacted.
Yes.
That are actually So and in terms of like what does this mean? What's more important than the scale or where you put the effort investment is how you amplify the stories of success that are coming through from the actual people that are feeling the impact. How do you amplify those stories to actually then be able to use that to reinforce the business case and the success that you're having? So one of the things that seems to be coming through from people that we are talking to, this beyond the research, but around the API space, is that people are making investment in their API programs or initiatives, and they're not necessarily being able to see the benefits articulated in a way that they would traditionally understand. And I think there's a whole bunch of questions as to we should be asking, kind of, why is that? And part of it may be that the stories aren't being told in a way that is easy to connect to. And part of that, I think, is because the opportunities that APIs present aren't quantifiable in as easy a way as many other types of technology. So if you looked at something that is automating or digitizing an existing process, it's very simple to it's relatively simple to build a business case to say, this is the time, effort, and amount of time it takes to do this particular process. These are how many people are involved, or this is the number of, and demonstrating that some automation of that will have made something quicker, faster, or reduced the cost of doing it in some way. That's that's binary. It's easy to quantify.
Ice cream machine.
But if I produce a capability that allows some people to collaborate and work with our organization in ways that we've never imagined, that we can't actually compare today's world with, then the idea of how to build the business case and connect to that is a lot more complex. It requires more courage. People need to put themselves in a different headspace to either get behind, let alone be able to then support it.
It's super fascinating because now you've set this pattern. I'm like, oh yeah, that person and that person and that person, they're all like this. They're doing this. So now you've told it, I recognize who at our customers has been doing this and because of which their program has been successful. And so far I've been taking that for granted. I didn't have a good label for that. And I was taking it for granted, and I was talking to these people because normally these are the people that care about developer portals and developer experience and communication. But I've been talking to them about developer advocates and developer experience and how they need to get that, which is the ground cover. But then is it a product owner? Is it the product owner whose role it is to give the air cover? Or is there still a different role there? Is there like a shareholder PR or something like that? What have you seen in successful teams? Is that the product owner's job?
I think I'd be asking, could you maybe give me some examples of what you think the air cover is needed for? Because I think that then depends. You're talking about air cover for continued funding and investments. You're talking about air cover for the way that you're branded externally to the market. Are you talking about air cover for security risk? Are you talking of technical?
So I'm very practically. I'm thinking about somebody like Koen at ABN AMRO. He's been there for 5 or 6 years now, drumming the beats, like drumming the API beats. Just keep on going, organizing get-togethers, hackathons, slowly but surely changing the mindsets of both the employees, but also of the managers. And explaining the case for APIs over and over and over again until everybody finally gets it. And I think, so that's what I mean is that I knew that was necessary to be successful, but I hadn't thought about it in this, these are two separate jobs. There's, talk to the organization on the people that are impacted by it, and talk to the people that need to fund it and need to understand it to be able to not pull the plug on something good.
Yeah. Again, I see it's less of an either or. It's more about where at a point in time do you choose to put most of your energy, because there's only so much capacity you've got at a point in time in order to be able to create and communicate. So, and what's interesting is where you choose to stand on that will change. And I think it's just one of the things that's important to resonate. But it does allow people to, I think, ask themselves, where am I spending a lot of my energy in the team in terms of and where are my messages getting heard or not, and how, if I'm struggling to get my message heard, is it because of the message? Is it because it's me? I'm just not known as somebody who is easily able to explain in terms. Is it that I haven't? So people, there's practical things that you need to do about finding who else can be telling my story, who happens to be somebody that may listen to me more easily. And who do they represent, and how are they perceived? And then that's very human, rather than
it's
kind
super
of organizational.
Super fascinating, because that's like, so I always had this. So it's not just technology. Just don't focus on the technology. And now you've added like a second layer of humanness that you need to watch out for, which is really, really interesting and exciting. It makes me wonder. There's this book. It's about how to drive change in a complex, adaptive way, and in which the authors are talking about 4 ways to drive change. They talk about you can change the container, so you can change the teams, and that will change the system. You can do transformative interactions. It's like where you are having interactions and they transform the participants. This feels like this features into that. Are these the transformative interactions then, I guess, right? That you're having? Yeah. With both the interesting. Because you're changing the system. It's not just plugging in technology. You have to actually change the behavior of what people are doing and how they're doing things. And that's much more than just the technology implementation. And like what you hinted at, that the definition of stupidity, like doing the same thing all over and over and over again and hoping that something will change, and nothing changes, because so if you're just re-implementing with another technology, you're not going to get a different outcome. You've been doing the wrong things. That's really, really interesting. Yeah.
It makes me think about some of our other conversations and where people start with their API programs. Some people are starting with their API programs focusing on reducing cost by providing an interface that is going to, automate some interaction. And in some ways that becomes the idea that more real-time data as a flow instead of as a recurring batch that might be handled, in a manual or automated way. People see value. They start seeing value that they didn't anticipate when they start getting to that, dynamic connection. And so people can think of it as, a cost-saving, automating type effort. And then they start realizing benefits beyond just the value of the automation. They start seeing value from the real-timeness that they get there and how that increases their velocity. And so I think we're already learning how to help people with that. But there are still so many people who I think don't see the real opportunities that an API program enables, which is when you start creating space for innovation either with your company or in partnership with an external stakeholder, a customer, a partner who's consuming an API, and the thing that they build is something that wouldn't have been built otherwise. And Christoph, even yesterday, we were talking about the fact that an API program might not be considered a success if you're not being surprised by uses that people have come up with for your APIs, or how they're applying your APIs in unexpected ways. And that's part of the value of doing this. And I'm just wondering, Claire, from your work, how much of the business cases and API programs that you've seen either understand this future innovation that could mean new products, new revenue streams that weren't even considered. And in that case, it's been a strategic investment without necessarily knowing the outcome, and how teams have transformed to that place. Or are they starting and limiting themselves too much by just thinking about this as a cost savings initiative by automating, this interface?
There isn't there isn't a kind of straightforward answer, because it does really depend on the industry. It depends on the maturity, the capability, environment internally, how much experience there already is on the ground, the skills, all sorts of things. But I think this, I've been curious particularly about why is it that people don't necessarily, I was going to say get it, sounds a little bit on it, but recognize this opportunity. And I've been through part of it myself in a way. I think it's easy to try or to fall into thinking of APIs as another version of a type of technology that people are potentially used to. So, it's kind of like it's just a bit of integration. It's just a newer form of integration, isn't it? Therefore, I can get that it, the opportunity for it to deliver where perhaps a lot of other integration promises have struggled to realize opportunities. That's a quite straightforward thing to get on board and understand. I think the thing that is more challenging is that the aha moment that people start getting to when they realize that it's not necessarily an aha moment, because I think it's kind of an incremental thing, but this opening up and positioning technology as a new way in which people can deliver on new business models that can't be conceived or even thought of requires a bit of vulnerability and humility in terms of kind of expectation. It requires a bit of vision and a bit of courage about getting behind something that feels very different. So opening up the organization to, at one level, potentially be competed with or disrupted by traditional or even non-traditional competitors is a very different way of thinking than many people who've looked at investment as being based on doing something either simpler, cheaper, easier, or doing a new thing, but it's kind of like a new way of doing something that is perhaps traditional. So that I think the other thing that requires what I call this inside out thinking as opposed to outside in thinking. You need the outside in thinking to give some opportunities of what else are people doing, but the inside out thinking that you need is you start, for example, having a engineering or development community as your customers. Now that for many organizations is quite a different way of thinking than customers who buy your products, and the traditional channels through which you get to those customers. You can think of new ways in which to do it, but to actually then start thinking, well, in fact, the people who are going to be using my product and who are going to be influencing the people to buy it are not necessarily a community that would have ever thought of traditionally as customers. So that's and then being able to build the case for doing that is a bit subtly different. And then in working with the IT community in an organization, giving them the opportunity to take the lead on how some of this might look and be experienced is, again, a different way. I mean, there are organizations who would go to, let's say, business-to-business type scenarios where there are very deep, long-standing relationships between one company selling very complex products to specific business customers. They will often be used to pulling together a delivery team and a bid team who represent disciplines, particularly if there's a lot of IT integration involved in that relationship. So they'll need some legal people, they'll need some finance people, they'll need some risk people, they'll need some certainly some IT people working as part of that team to build the relationship. But in an API scenario where you're offering API products out to communities beyond the traditional thought space of customers for an organization, you're inviting your IT teams to show you how that is done to a large extent, and that's a different dynamic.
But is it the right dynamic? Because I see, like, if you're looking at the API design first movement, then basically people are saying, like, well, don't make this make sure that everybody's around the table discussing how this is going to work, because this is not just an IT interface. So I think we're going back to, this is not just technology, like there's humans involved, and you need to make sure that everybody's heard.
And I couldn't agree more, Christoph. We've seen it, we tend to group these types of people who need to get behind API success as falling into three groups of you call it your traditional business sponsorship, the kind of part of the community, the IT teams, and the grouping of, I kind of call them transformation or digital teams. They have kind of and these are not organizational structures. This is looking at the functional capabilities. But that first group is leading with the big strategic vision, is explaining how creating an environment in which one can open up to new markets, open up to new different ways of collaborating with partners that haven't happened in the past, getting behind and championing the support and empowering teams to then come up with API products and come up with capability and the cultural change. So that's your business side that needs to be involved and leading. You've got your IT side, ensuring that the right API management tooling and platforms and engineering capability and robustness of execution is right, and that new ideas can come forward perhaps from existing internal development communities. But then the third is this, and it's more than an interpreter. It's not just an interpreter of business requirements, to be and to act as a kind of a bridge between business and IT. These three groups all are kind of peers in this API space. But this third group is there to really deeply understand how the strategy and opportunities can be brought to life in the priorities for the different types of API products. So they'll typically be, that's where the product ownership leadership will quite often come from, that kind of capability. So those are the three groups that we would see. Now they're not a hierarchy per se, but they're three sets of three disciplines that are all important to come behind, and they're all key to driving the organization's broader transformation and building experience and muscle and credibility with delivering change that is continuously improving. And APIs are kind of where they all come together.
It's interesting to me because as I think about the interactions with customers and prospects that I've had, the second and third group we quite commonly talk to, and they each approach the problem a little differently. And sometimes we also talk to that first group as well, but usually they're brought in afterwards in my experience. And it seems to me that at least part of what we hope to do through this podcast is to help business leaders understand what digital transformation is all about and where the value is beyond, just this speeding up of interactions and automating interactions, that there are new opportunities that are out there, and, trying to illuminate the path to those new opportunities. And I know in our as we were organizing for the call, some of the discussion we had, I'd like to bring directly to the surface now, which is you talked about an accidental versus an intentional API team, the differences there. And in some cases, I think we've talked to, many in both camps. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two different types of teams, how you see it, and how you see them approaching the space and the problems in front of them.
Sure. I guess it's probably worth qualifying what I mean by an API team. So my definition for an API team is an organization's concentration of expertise and capability around APIs. So it's the people who enable success for others in building, using, or marketing APIs. So, and in a practical sense, they're the people who, if they don't have an API responsibility in their job description or role, they are spending most of their, maybe 80% or more of their role in and around the practice or the execution of APIs, or the design or the strategization around them. But what can happen in many organizations is that this API team can be sort of pulled together from just because they'd had some interest, or or somebody tapped them on the shoulder and got them involved. But the metaphor I use, it's a little bit like the that Brat Pack movie from the 80s, The Breakfast Club, where you've got this collection of people who've been thrown together for a day's detention as teenagers from high school. They've got a lot of maybe preconceived ideas about where each other stands from who the people are that they normally hang out with. But through the movie, they kind of open up a little bit, share a bit about kind of who they are as people. They find they have a bit more in common than they thought. They go on some adventures. They take a few risks. Romance, and friendships bloom. And within the space of the day, everyone's not really sure by the end of it whether it will last, whether it'll be sticky by the time they get, after the first day back at school, whether to resort or whether they need some more kind of these interventions, these kind of situations to come together. But you could argue that they kind of accidentally came together. So they represent a great diverse group. But it takes quite a long time for them to actually all celebrate and recognize what they're going to get out of this day. And I think for people, and particularly now, in this situation of everybody working remotely for now, many months, longer than they ever perhaps expected, and this will be it for so much of the future going forward, that people who may be in these API teams are feeling like it's kind of a bit of a tug of war. They're needing to both work hard on justifying why this is so important. They can see many case studies in all different industries, in all different scenarios as to why this is important. It's just not necessarily easy to be able to explain for that particular organization exactly what will make a difference for them. I think this is one of the reasons why it's not necessarily understood is it's too generic for that business group. It's kind of like too ethereal, too theoretical. It's like, how is it going to make a difference for my business in the part of the business that I'm in? So people are they're needing to get access to resources. They're trying to find time in people's diaries. You can't just bump into somebody in the building corridor. You've actually now got to book half an hour's time with somebody. Now that can be, depending on if you're trying to get attention with the people who need to be able to support you, who need to hear the great stories of the success that you're having, it's logistically quite difficult, particularly if your role and responsibility feels a bit more accidental than you have been intentionally appointed as a group and collected to represent the various parts of the organization that needs to get together and align around this. And how does it become sort of, I call it less of a tug of war and more kind of meerkat experience, looking out, connecting, because there's a lot of API opportunities that come from spending time listening to podcasts like these that you're doing, spending time connecting with other people in similar or adjacent industries, connecting with people who are across the latest technology opportunities, finding it. So you need to be, scanning and sensing and building community, and that's pretty hard to do if this is being juggled with a million other things. And so I think part of this question, and this doesn't just, by the way, go to APIs. It's been the case for initiative investments over a long time, is how do you empower and resource and not distract the group that is going to make it successful. We'll know if it's 100% of the job and everybody can swarm around it and get some focus, build that sense of a strong, high-performing team and capability. You can move mountains really fast, but many people are having to do many, many other things as well. And at a time when also they're kind of coping with a whole lot of other stuff going on. And if it's not just in their own lives, it's in the lives of the people around them. So the time now is to be very sensitive to what else is going on, and then listening to people so that they can have an opportunity to show the success that they're making with their API steps, and then interpreting that into the ways, the measures, the metrics, if the audiences are, if they need to connect to both the quantitative piece as well as the emotional connection, the difference that it's making for community or the employees or the people working in the environment, etc.
So what I'm hearing is that it's easy to create a shared purpose if a team is intentional, and if they're getting the time to focus on this, because they're already thrown together and they're given enough time to work on that shared purpose, that shared evolving purpose that they need to be able to be successful, than if it's an accidental team. And it's interesting. I think I found the book that I was referring to. It's called Facilitating Organizational Change. It's by Glenda Eoyang and Edwin E. Olson. And one quote that I like to read out. I've never done this before, but somehow I thought this would fit here. Is rather than focusing at the macro strategic level of the organizational system, complexity theory suggests that the most powerful processes of change occur at the micro level, where relationships, interactions, small experiments, and simple rules shape emerging patterns. So I love this book because it's actually talking about the how of making change happen, and and about complex adaptive systems, and I strongly believe that APIs are basically about executing on digital at scale. Executing on Agile at scale using complex adaptive systems and signal boundary systems that APIs help us to build with coupled teams that are loosely coupled through APIs. And I think that brings us to another topic you said you wanted to cover, is this: how do APIs help this wider change? And especially in large and complex organizations, how can they become more purposeful, more adaptive? And it was exciting that this is one of the topics you wanted to cover, because that really fits in this whole complex adaptive systems world model that that I keep seeing everywhere. So
that's right.
Do you have stories that came up in your research?
Yeah. So
about this change, like the bow wave, why did you pick that metaphor?
Because if you can get going with identifying an opportunity to deliver, initially it might be even something quite simple in API, something that is potentially usable internally, but as if it was an external use, for example. Well, in order to be able to get that not just delivered, but to also have the right team behind it and long-running piece of it, the things that need to be true, or the things that need to be working is you need to know how you're going to maintain and fund it over time. You need it to be managed by somebody who both understands its business potential context that can be represented, that can represent it and understand, how to prioritize its technical needs. It needs the right engineering behind it for it to be secure, stable, cloud-enabled, visible, well-documented. It needs to be, you need to try it out, give it a go, get feedback, then recognize that you can change it quite quickly. You can try it out in things and the operating model to support it needs the IT team potentially to be managing the means by which it is made available. The business, what I call that kind of product ownership, or maybe it starts out as transformation digital team, needs to be able to continuously find out new opportunities for it to be leveraged and used. And the business stakeholder group needs to be able to fund it in a way that allows it to do that on a long-term basis rather than through a project sense. So it pushes into, and in order to do that operating model, you've got to rethink the traditional project construct for how you deliver IT-enabled change, because this becomes a long-running component that both enables other projects and other initiatives to be capable and becomes actually a product in its own right. So it calls on a whole lot of other things to need to be working. And although it may be initially not necessarily well understood, it can quite quickly be the visible face into a whole lot of other complexity that perhaps is going on behind the scenes that people can then get behind and see is really used. So you can show, a developer portal very visibly. You can show the types of offerings that could be made. You can point to other organizations, it's all in the public domain, how people are actually presenting themselves through the world of APIs as a way of actually reinforcing what you're offering. So that's why I kind of think, I should also add, by the way, that the team behind it needs to be highly collaborative, needs to be able to product think, needs to be able to experiment, all of these things, and they need to be able to think through the commercial, the security, like all the other. It requires them to role model what you want to be able to do elsewhere. So therefore, I think it should be a good place to show what a transformed organization starts looking like.
This makes me think of the concept of a scaffolding species that I learned from Kevin Kelly's book Out of Control, where he talks about how to start an ecosystem, sometimes you need a scaffolding species that's there to just kickstart everything. And it was the example of an island where they were trying to bring back cypress trees. Because there was like a special bird that burrowed under, they were tipped just right, and then the bird would burrow under it, and they wanted to bring back that bird, and it was like a whole complex story. And then they tried planting these trees, and the first storm they all just blew over, and it just didn't work. So they realized that they needed to first bring in another tree that didn't used to grow there anymore, but they used to be there like a long, long, long time ago, before the cypresses really got started. So maybe is that what an API or that some API programs could be? Like, are there scaffolding species in the API programs? Things that you might not be doing this forever, but it's going to get you started with this transformation?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think a lot of the engineering DevOps capabilities and those sorts of things, which are and it's not just the tooling, but the practices and capabilities that go along behind the scenes, and a continuous delivery model. All of those activities become a non-negotiable in an API management sense, and of course have application much more broadly. So I think that can be one of the ways. I did in the research I was doing, I did ask people about where they would put their effort and investment in a trade-off on how they would look to scale Agile in their organizations. So would they choose to put their effort into a top-down kind of mindset shift leadership model from the top, or would they put their effort and investment in kind of engineering-based process automation at the coalface of the ground floor of IT delivery that would enable them to be able to scale kind of, but ahead of where the top-down view came from. So, in other words, do you make a kind of a big scale executive commitment to, we are now going to be whether you use the term agile or a more customer and externally focused organization with different structures, or do you look at building pockets of experience with the right kind of tooling and capability? Because if you put all your effort into the top down, you might not actually be able to be ready to execute on the ground. But if you put all your effort in executing on the ground, it's really, really hard to then get support. So what I heard from the people that I spoke to was that they would put about 65% of their effort on average on that top-down leadership view, and about 35% of their effort and investment towards building bottom-up capability. But it was a little bit in higher complexity organizations. They would move a little bit more, just over 50% of their effort into that top-down, because they recognize that in a highly complex organization, the need to have the right processes underneath for the actual IT automation becomes a bottleneck to quickly fin up. So they had a little bit more of an orientation, and some of them went fairly heavily on that. It was also a maturity thing. So it was kind of in the higher complexity organizations I spoke to, they were further along their API, so their transformation journeys, and therefore they were more inclined to need effort on that end.
Christoph, I was getting concerned that you hadn't brought in an example from biology. So thank you. I was on the edge of my seat. That's fantastic. I think the question of understanding what type of organization you're in regarding this maturity and complexity, these two axes maybe, and maybe there are other axes that we should be thinking about too. But from your experience, Claire, do people understand what type of organization they're in? Or are there things that they can do kind of as litmus tests or assessments to help them understand how they need to be thinking about the investment? I mean, some of this is intuitive to some leaders. It might not be intuitive to everyone. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think particularly in an API sense, I think this question of how do you identify as an organization to inform the API strategy that you are adopting is important. So if you are looking to use APIs to enable a lot of your digitization, a lot of your, if you're keeping your same identity, but you're using APIs to explore new horizons, that is different than if you see APIs as a way of realizing a new identity for your business. So I used to be, our organization used to identify primarily as, let's say, an insurer, but it now identifies as a technology company who happens to know a bit about insurance, as opposed to an insurer that knew about tech. But I think, so that's the second one. And then the third one is there are organizations for whom APIs is the business. They identify as an API business as distinct from a tech business that's good at APIs. And I think each of those three, and you could argue that there are some organizations who are kind of doing a little bit of a blend of those if they're incubating separate businesses and so on to role model new ways of doing. But I see them as falling into those three types. And each of those then informs, to your point, a different rationale and focus and priority and everything else for your API execution.
So how do you find a sweet spot? It's like, because it feels almost like this is like dancing or something like that, where you need, or entrepreneurship for that matter, like where, you're swinging all the plates and you have to like somehow figure out which ones are about to fall. And then keeps swinging.
Yeah.
Is it just art, or is there a science to this? To finding like how to demonstrate the value to your stakeholders and still make it big enough, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think there is an art element for sure. I mean that from a, but that kind of implies that you could sort of maybe even paint a picture that's not a real picture. The science element to me is the fact base that supports it. Now, the thing that is interesting is so the fact base that supports it, the evidence, the difference that's being made, it needs some metrics and some quantifiable progress points. The art is where you may choose to go and first try out and then try out again and pivot and to actually get some of those data points. And then there's an art element, or you could actually argue there's science. And I think the sorts of books you're referring to are about taking a rigorous approach to analysing who is it that's going to need to understand and get behind this, and what are going to be the most effective ways for us to be able to communicate that and create momentum about a bow wave that other people can get behind. I think when in the research that I was doing, one of the things that I asked people was to get from their experience with making IT-enabled change stick, what measurement systems did they choose to use for measuring progress? So to this very point about how to actually get the story told, and the trade-off was that you could either choose to show progress specifically against well-known and well-shared common metrics that the organization used to manage its performance. So by doing this change, we will make a difference to this revenue uplift, this product penetration, product impact, sales, or this type of productivity or saving or IT cost or whatever. And on the other side, do you put your effort and investment into new measurement systems that actually increment and change as you go through your journey of change? So in other words, you've got kind of, and what people said is that they would actually put a little bit more than half, about 55% of their effort towards new measurement systems. So they would work and put a lot of effort into setting new bars, and a bit more effort into that than they would just measuring their performance against current bars. So what does that mean in this context in terms of the art and the science? Is that the science side of it is continuously showing that you are making a difference on the things that are important for the organization, the big measure. But it is likely that the small changes you are making are very hard to show a direct impact on that. So the classic thing might be, so let's say, for example, you're tracking to a operational efficiency, a number of people working in a particular function or something like that you're introducing automation to, or you're digitizing part of a customer process, maybe is an easier one. You could show you might be able to show that the amount of time it takes for customers to go through that process overall has reduced over a time and made it more efficient, and they're getting a better experience. But it's quite often hard for that to be able to be specifically accountable to the one initiative that you're working on. And therefore, you're better to actually see yourselves as kind of contributors, attract to that, but also spend effort on saying, well, in this month or these 3 months, this is what the difference that we've made. We've done an experiment, we've done a structured piece of work towards the goal that we're going on. And now that we have matured, we're going to look and see what are whether that set of metrics is still the things that we want to measure the next time around. So it's the classic start out by measuring how many APIs you've got. That's not very relevant after a while, because having too many APIs that might involve a lot of duplication and reuse means the number of APIs is not necessarily a measure that's encouraging the right behavior and activity. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of art and the sciences.
Right. It's also like we're doing this exercise now in our company where we're moving towards KPI and OKR based organization, because we are now 60 people, more than 60, and it's too big to do it the way that we used to do it. And the way that what I realized is that KPIs and OKRs are also in themselves kind of like APIs, because they allow you to decouple your organization, because you can set, like a team can become responsible for their own objectives and their own measurements that they have control over. And you don't have to like enforce from top down, like, hey, you didn't do your job or something like that. They just can see for themselves, like, we're doing well or we're not doing all that well. And I think what I realized from what you described is that, so the API team, well, it is like, I've seen some organizations call it a center of excellence or something like that. It really needs to be its own team with its own objectives. But even though that it has a bigger transformational goal for transforming the rest of the organization, it's maybe the API team is a scaffolding species. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's supposed to disappear eventually, but it's there to transform the organization. That's an interesting one. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is a bit, it is very much kind of horses for courses in terms of what's right at that point in time. But if you're building an API team, the first thing, it's an intentional team if it's expected to be long running rather than being based on a project, which is where a lot of them start. However, if at the point in time that for that organization, it's right to be running it under a project construct, then that might be the best place to start. But the point, to your point in the scaffolding context, is the metrics that you choose to measure the impact and performance and effectiveness of that API team can expect to grow over time. So, but what is perhaps, and that team will both be able to respond to and work out and promote certain metrics. What you don't want to do is, you might start out with something that people understand as being more and looking more like a project type of set of goals, because that's what everybody understands. But over time, and that might be based on output and how long it takes to deliver, but over time, as more of the API capability and expertise, as the API team becomes more spread through the organization, because it's a virtual team, not an enablement or a center of excellence kind of functional organizational capability that you're referring to. It might actually be, seated expertise in many different parts of the organization that its performance will expect to evolve, and its role, it may become. So the other thing that I'm sure you've seen this, we've seen this in multiple organizations, that APIs sort of pop up from somewhere, and one group ends up being the sort of the almost slightly accidental center of capability. And because things are a little bit not necessarily controlled, or there's a bit too much duplication or inconsistency, so there's a need to sort of bring it back in and, inverted commas, centralize it to some extent. But then that maturity then gets to actually being much more of a federated type of capability, and more about providing the standards, the tooling, the platforms that enable other people internally and beyond the organization to use and leverage and both produce and consume APIs. So that's an example of how a number of companies seem to mature through it. And to your point, the KPIs that they would use to be measured in terms of the factors will probably change on a quarterly basis, or certainly every six months, and certainly beyond every 12.
It makes me think two things. First thing, Christoph, is we've been talking about a dev portal maturity model, and we also need to be thinking about the second thing, which is the change and transformation of a team. Mm. And I'm not sure that the team needs to go away, and that shouldn't be the goal, but the transformation of the team should be part of the maturity of an API program. I
think it's like the transformation. So you might start. Well, this is also something I've seen in the inner sourcing world, is that you might start with an accidental team, but then one of the people in the accidental team goes like, this is interesting. Let's make the business case, and goes to the board of directors, gets a couple of millions, and now there's an actual intentional team. But so I think that the transition there, the transformation that you're talking about, Mark, is about finding purpose and finding enough value to be able to keep on living and keep on continuing. So it's a self perpetuating pattern. I think the most important part, and this is also the thing that the API community is talking so much about, is like your API should not be a project; it should be a product. Because if it's a project, it means that it's a finite thing, and it will not survive. People won't trust it, etc., etc. The same thing also applies for the program. The program needs to be its own kind of product, its own kind of self-perpetuating, living thing that keeps changing and transforming the organization. And through the transformation that it creates, it actually self-perpetuates itself because it's showing its value in the transformation that it's enabling.
You also, that's just a great point. One also needs to ask about what type of people you need in the team at what point during that kind of maturity, because early on, it's the explorer mode. These are the people who are, whether you call it like, it's almost like you're going to colonize a new country, but instead of colonizing, which you used to do, you're actually now talking about setting up new trade agreements, right? So the people that go out to the first, explore the new territory, tend to be quite, there'll be a small team. They're very self-sufficient. They're quite multi-skilled. They're happy to kind of scale because they don't know whether they're going to have to scale mountains, fend off mosquitoes, or live in the desert or something. So that's kind of the early stage explorers. But over time, if more people are following them, you actually need people who can sensibly build safe communities for a larger, less multi-skilled group of people to be able to come along. So how does your API capability and the people that are supporting it move from perhaps the people who are always thinking broadly, which is great, but you actually need people who can execute process that at scale will be able to be used by a larger number of people. So that it's not just the metrics and the measures will complement that, because you'll be looking to mature those capabilities in order to make that change lasting.
That's really fascinating. Thinking about the maturing in that way, your analogy is really helpful. It leads me to another question, which is, are there roles that are neglected, not capabilities of people, from explorer generalists to scaling infrastructure specialists, but are there specific types of roles that are overlooked that you've seen contribute to the success or failure of a program?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, Mark, about roles, but it's also interestingly one that perhaps people maybe overly focus on the role title and less about what skills and capabilities that they need. So what I've been quite interested about and having the opportunity of working within the global API community is how labels and job titles and roles and things are bubbling up all over the place and being variously described. So I think what's more important is what is the collection of competencies and capabilities that you need at the point in time, and who are the best people, and what are they typically known as maybe in the market that is going to be right for where one's delivering change. And secondly, one also needs to be able to look at the kind of mix of individuals and skills to make sure that you've got the right blend of commercial and technical acumen, and both exploratory and kind of security, if you like, security with a sort of safety environment. I think what I've been quite interested in is I've been looking at things like job descriptions for product owners. And when I peel them back, they don't actually look very different from Scrum Masters, or even that look actually peel them back as kind of project managers. So if they've got a lot of the responsibility is around coordinating and influencing and managing the bridge between things, that to me is very different than being able to champion for the opportunity and the capability and the commercial vision, and living the realization of that strategy and being able to help facilitate the right priorities between, technical and customer priorities.
We had that discussion this week.
Oh, did you?
Right, Mark?
Interesting.
Yeah.
The other one that I have found interesting for those, I think, to those who are not perhaps as close to the API community or even the tech industry, is how competencies like developer relations, developer advocacy, which are so, are quite mature in certain businesses, are completely unheard of in others. And so I think that's one that's probably going to be a very much a growing skill. I'm sure you could talk to some of the more technical skills that you see people are needing behind the scenes, but those are ones that I think there's a big difference between the good and the great. And it's also an area that's maturing very fast. So I think that if you probably got 20 developer relations specialists together, you would see 20 very, very different types of competencies and interests and backgrounds, which is great, actually, potentially. But I wonder whether it has a risk of confusing for the industry. So I think there's probably a place to try and get a bit, to put some stakes in the ground about what these terms are and, what's the difference between.
I've wondered if that role specifically relates to how customer-centric an organization is. If they're highly empathetic towards their customers, they recognize the need for the role and they fill it. If they are kind of taking that inside out view instead of the outside in view, do they just miss the need for that?
I think Mark, spot on, but it goes back to this question about how as an organization you identify yourself in terms of where you see APIs as part of realizing your strategy. So if APIs are your business, then clearly that developer marketing aspect is kind of a no-brainer. If you are more heavily focused, particularly at a point of time, on the opportunity internally for simplifying processes and speeding up the ability to undertake change, then you're going to be more in the developer advocacy internally focused perspective. But I think the discipline of thinking about developers as the building of the developer experience, whether that's internal or external, is a competency that is still emerging for many organizations.
And at the same time, it has been labeled and named. So it becomes something that we can describe and look for and recommend. Like, what I'm missing is, what is the counterpart? Like, what is the business experience, or whatever you want to call it? Like so you have the developer experience, which is for the people, the ground cover. But what is the air cover term? Is that business experience? Is that business value? I don't know. Or do we need it feels like we need another neologism so that we can put a label on it and say, like, okay, this is something you need to be looking for.
So this is where you're talking about business use of APIs in a no-code, low-code code. Yeah, okay. I was thinking of air cover earlier in the sense of providing support for investment and championing.
Yes, well, I meant that. I meant what you said. The other one is still, that's the affordances, like looking for the affordances of your APIs. But so you have the developer. So what we have seen, the way we talk about it is that you need to think about the business and about the business person and developer persona. The developer persona needs a good developer experience. The business persona needs to understand what the value is. They need to be able to perceive the value, or maybe it's perceivable value or value perception. I don't know.
Or is it more that they need to be able to translate its opportunity for value? Because it's actually what they do with it that determines whether or not.
So developer experience is the inverse of API friction. So you're taking away any friction that makes it harder to use an API. What is it that you're doing in the business side? It's like value recognition. I'm not sure.
Is it much more complex than saving time from having to define and justify and get behind a whole lot of change that would have to be delivered somehow else?
Yeah.
I guess I don't see it as different than developer friction, and the same applies, is that the business person's experience is analogous to the sources of friction that we try to eliminate in a developer portal. You're trying to give the building blocks that a business person needs as efficiently as possible for them to understand the value that you bring, understand the business terms that you're offering. And
so maybe it really is business experience. And maybe it really is about removing business friction, where you need to clearly articulate in words that the person that's supposed to be reading this is going to understand just at the right level of understanding that they are, so that they will be able to understand what this is all about and how they can use it, so that they can then actually use the tool. Because if you don't understand what a tool is for, you are not going to use it. So it's much more tightly coupled to purpose, like the purpose of the API. So I'm talking about individual APIs. So like we're kind of shifting scales up and down, but there's a fractal pattern. So like if you know how to deliver this for individual APIs, you can build it up for the whole program. But maybe this, because I have actually a slide in my strategy webinar about dev portals where I talk about your usage of your API equals your perceived value times your developer experience. And your developer experience is the inverse of API friction. Maybe there's something else that perceived value represents. And because perceived value is also very ephemeral, just like developer experience. It's something like perceived value. Yeah. let's go and sit in a coffee bar and talk philosophy. How do you make it tangible?
It strikes me that it's I'm not hung up on naming it friction or experience, but it's understanding the business proposition, but it's also making sure that someone can get to that. So let me back up. If you take perceived value, the value is seen as I see the opportunity and I see kind of the cost. And sometimes APIs and products fail because the cost that is asked for, the technical solution is fine, and the value that is seen is fine, but it's priced wrong for the potential use. If we go back to that idea that if you're not being surprised by your API program, how people are using your APIs and they're not innovating with them, then perhaps you've over-constrained or under-constrained your APIs. And so in the case of this value, if your pricing model is inflexible or your business terms are inflexible and people can't understand them, then it doesn't matter what kind of value that they can see in working with you, they're not going to be able to achieve that value because of this these limitations. So
it's value friction.
It's value friction.
It's value friction. It's the thing that keeps the value from flowing. Interesting.
I think we're going to have to sleep on that and come back to it. That's a good one. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. This is really cool. It's like, it's really striking. So, and this touches on the topic. So the women in APIs world. So I've been blown away by the ideas that Katrien van Gijzel at KBC put together, because she came from a completely different angle, just completely different perspective. And it was like, oh, wow, okay. So it's a similar experience I'm having now. It's just like, oh, we totally didn't think about this part. And it's like we were talking about it, but we just never really thought it through because it was just so focused on the developer part. And yes, developers are very important. Developer experience is super important, but it's not the only thing, because you can have the beautiful API. If the business model doesn't work, then nobody's going to use it. Or if you don't explain it, nobody's going to use it. But it's really interesting to figure out, like, how can we coin a term that's going to help us to talk about it, so we can bring it out of the shadows and bring it more to the forefront so that people understand that. Interesting.
It makes me think of, if I understand the concept correctly, and my apologies if I misspeaking here, but in many Eastern cultures, the idea exists, I believe, that something isn't really manifest until it's named. And by naming it, it then becomes reality, and you can deal with it then. But until it's named, it's not there. And it seems like we've been operating in this space where there's something very important that we haven't given a name. And by naming it, we can acknowledge it better and think about it and address it. This is really good. I know that we made a list of things to talk about before the program, and there is a lot of things that we didn't get to, which makes me think that we need to chew on some of what we've bitten off here and come back to address some of those other things, because you've got a lot of really great insights, Claire. But it strikes me that this is probably a good place for us to kind of wrap it and sit and ponder value friction.
I think we're already probably at a double episode length.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible.
But this was really, really good. There's some completely new ideas that came out. This was a really good conversation.
Yeah,
thank you.
Oh, thank you both. It's been a delight, and certainly left me with things to marinate over and the thought process as well. So, as ever, I've always enjoyed listening to your thoughts and perspectives. Enjoying the conversation.
Well, Claire, I've really enjoyed the sharpness and focus that you've been able to bring to some things that were out of focus or amorphous for me. And I hope that our listeners have that same experience. With that, I guess we'll wrap up. Thanks again, Claire. And to our audience, as always, we're very interested in your feedback. Write us at info@pronovix.com if you have comments, suggestions for topics or guests you would like to see us tackle or people to talk to. and we won't tackle people, especially in the time of COVID. We're all wearing our masks and staying distant. So this is really good. It's a work in progress. We're learning a lot. We hope you're learning a lot, and we hope that everyone is staying well. And tune in next time, and we'll have another guest and another set of topics to review. And Claire, I'd love to have you back in the future to get more into some of the things that we didn't even touch on that seemed like we really had. It's a bit like discovering that some of these topics were actually icebergs. You see the tip, and you don't see quite how deep some of these things go, and so it's really, really cool.
As long as one doesn't imply that they're dangerous, I think that.
Well, as long as you know it's there, it's okay.
Yeah, only if you fell into them.
It's only if you don't know that it's there that you need to watch out. Well, no, that you don't watch out. And then, yeah.
Good point. No, it's been an absolute privilege. So thank you both very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to the API Resilience Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please follow us to hear our latest episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. And if you have any comments or feedback you would like to share, please drop us an email at podcasts@pronovix.com. Until next time, we wish you well and hope you find success in all your endeavors.